And that's how I lived a lot of my life, was trying to be perfect so I could be acceptable. And what I've found is, wow, the more imperfect I am, the more acceptable I've actually become.
Welcome to The One You Feed. Thanks for joining us. Our guest on this episode is Sarmiento, a practitioner of Vipassana meditation since 1998. They are the guiding teacher of the Insight Meditation community of Washington's BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ Sanghas, a mentor for the Mindfulness Meditation Teachers Certification Program and Cloud Sangha, a contributor to the 10% Happier app, and a graduate of Spirit Rock's Community Dharma Leader Training Program.
Hi, La. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Eric. Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I am really happy to have you on, and I look forward to this conversation. Let's start like we always do with the parable. In the parable, there's a grandparent who's talking with their grandchild, and they say, in life, there are two wolves inside of us that are always at battle. One is a good wolf, which represents things like kindness and bravery and love. And the other is a bad wolf, which represents things like greed and hatred and fear. And the grandchild stops and thinks about it for a second, looks up at their grandparent and says, well, which one wins? And the grandparent says, the one you feed. So I'd like to start off by asking you what that parable means to you in your life and in the work that you do.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, it's a very powerful parable, and it's interesting because when I was reflecting on it, I wasn't really thinking of it as a good wolf or a bad wolf. For me, it was a younger wolf and an older wolf. And the younger wolf in me was one who, at a very early age, recognized that my gender identity, my sexual orientation, the race, ethnicity of my being was not one that was acceptable in this country. My parents immigrated from the Philippines, and so, and I came over when I was 10 months old. And with that recognition of those social identities, I internalized a lot of external messages that I wasn't okay, that there was something wrong with me, that even I didn't, wasn't worthy of existence, that I could be beaten or killed for who I was, And so I really felt strongly that I needed to find a way to fit in. I needed to find a way of being acceptable. And so my strategy was to assimilate, into dominant culture. And so really forsaking a lot of who I was. And it wasn't until I actually started practicing and studying the Dharma that I understood that, that wasn't who I was. I was actually okay. If you believe in sort of the Buddhist concept of Buddha nature, that, my innate goodness, wisdom, and compassion is inherent in me and is inherent in every being on the planet. And the more I was able to begin trusting and having faith and believing in that, I began to dismantle all those old messages that, kept telling me I wasn't enough, or I needed to prove myself constantly, or I needed to do more in order to be acceptable or feel a sense of belonging in the larger culture. And so both those wolves still live in me. And, it's like moments like this when I'm asked to be in an interview with a little one in me is like, no, we can't share who we are. They're not going to like us if we're, authentically who we are. And then the older part of me is, that's basically what I've been teaching, in the way I offer the Dharma in terms of self-acceptance, self-love, self-compassion, that we all are deserving of love, respect, dignity, and that, the more I allow externals to determine my worth, I'm going to suffer. The more that I recognize that I'm already good inside, and what anyone else thinks of me or how society or culture thinks of me, that's really none of my business, ultimately. So it really is making that distinction and beginning to just really believe that I'm okay. Everybody is okay. We just have these constructs that have been created to dominate, over certain kinds of people, whether it be race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, abilities, class, etc. So the wolf that I choose to cultivate is my older one, that has this clarity, that has this willingness to, just cultivate continued acceptance of myself so that I can continue to accept others for who they are. We may disagree in terms of beliefs and things, but I always remember that we're all human beings and we all deserve, compassion and love and respect, even if our, beliefs differ from each other.
Kind of jumping way ahead in your story to that point about what you just said there. Even if our beliefs are different, we can see the beauty in one another. In one of your Dharma talks, you tell a really beautiful story about a woman named Mary from Texas, who's a Trump supporter at a rally that you, or not a rally, at a Dharma talk that you went to. Can you share a little bit about that? Just something you said there sort of just brought that to mind for me. And I thought it might be a lovely story to hear.
Sure. Thank you, Eric. So you're referring to a day-long retreat that I did at the Dharma Ranch outside of Austin, Texas. And Mary happened to be neighbors with the folks that owned the retreat center. And she was just really curious about meditation and mindfulness. She's always, wanting to grow and learn. And she identified as a Republican. And so I didn't really know this when we were, in the retreat, but she was very engaged. She was very open and had just very lovely things to say, after the retreat was over. And I just really appreciated, her willingness just to explore, something that she thought would be beneficial. And so to me, what's going to bridge our differences is just a willingness to want to understand each other, to be in relationship to one another so that we can, just get what informs, what we believe. And as long as we are able to do that in a way that's respectful and kind and generous, I think that those bridges are possible.
Yeah, you talk about how she wrote you a really lovely note afterwards saying, thank you for sharing about why, gender pronouns are important to you. And, just a really beautiful sort of coming together. And what I love about that story is it shows an openness from both of you. Right? That sort of connection doesn't happen if you're not both open, because you do see the world very differently. Some of the things she believes in, you would find no way, right? And vice versa. And yet you were able to have a human connection across that.
Yes, exactly. And that's what to me is so important in terms of having discussions, whether it be around race or sexual orientation or gender identity, is really relationship. When we're in relationship with each other, when we build trust, respect, love even with each other, then we can hang in there together, and be a bit more, if not accepting, tolerant, of to listen to what each other's opinions and beliefs are. And when we can discuss that and share what the impact is of these beliefs and opinions, we can probably get somewhere than just beating each other over the head with our signs, at protest or et cetera. So,
can I ask you some questions about your gender identity and how that sort of unfolded for you? So,
please.
So you talk about at a very early age, like you mentioned, you recognized your race wasn't right. You recognized pretty early on that you were attracted to little girls, not little boys. When did you start to recognize that your gender didn't feel right, and there weren't really words for it in the same way then that there are now? So I'm kind of curious, how did that feel inside, or how did you even think about it inside, maybe before you had the words to know what it was?
Right, exactly. So I love dressing. I hated dresses. Every picture of me in a dress growing up, I'm crying. It was really painful. So I loved wearing pants. I loved wearing boys' clothes, basically. I just felt more like myself when I dressed that way than if I were in a dress. And then I played with a lot of boys' toys. I didn't play with dolls or doll houses or Barbies or, anything that would be gendered as female. I played with guns. I loved roughhousing and, wrestling with other kids. I loved, riding my bike and just a lot more that would be gendered as male in terms of play behavior. It was really clear, and then when I became an adolescent and I started to, enter puberty and develop, I was like, oh no, like this just doesn't, feel right to me. And even, in terms of my sexual desires and who was I attracted to, it was not as a heterosexual person. It was definitely as a queer person. And so, there was just all these different things pointing in the direction of more sort of masculine identified. And I thought as a young child that, I need to become a man when I grow up so that I can live my life the way I want to. There was no option of being non-binary or gender conforming, back in the 70s and 80s. That, language only sort of came up in the 90s, etc. And so I just kind of sat with it. I didn't like being identified as a lesbian because I don't really feel like a woman. So, being attracted to women as a woman didn't fit for me. So I've always felt like I've been on the outside of a lot of the, sort of, whether it be a binary, gay or lesbian or male or female, it was just like I was not one or the other. I was kind of a combination, of it all.
Now you came out to your parents at I think you said 38, and I assume you came out that coming out was coming out as a lesbian, was not as a transgender person. Is that correct?
Right, because it came out as gay to them. Yeah.
You tell us about that. There's a lot of beauty and humor kind of in that story of finally coming out to your parents.
Yeah. So just to back up a little bit, I grew up in a very conservative household. My parents were staunch Republicans, Bush-loving, Fox News-watching folks. And, it was just not the atmosphere that I felt safe enough to come out to them, as a gay person, more or less a transgender person. So I feel like they were the last people that I came out to. And so I decided that, I would just wait and just kind of see how it would unfold. But I came out to the rest of the world when I was 21. And I went to this human potential workshops called the Landmark Forum. And in the forum, they really challenge you to do things that are holding you back in your life, And so for me, it was coming out to my parents. And so I decided, okay, I will come out to them. So I called my mom one day and I said, Mom, I want to come over. I have something really important to tell you. And she said, okay, come on over. And so I came over for lunch, and my parents always had the TV on. And so I said, can we turn Bonanza off for a second? And they're like, oh my gosh, this is really serious. We're turning the TV off. And so I said, I've been wanting to tell you this for a really long time. And that's that I'm gay. And I start getting really emotional. I'm crying. And my mother says, there's no need for you to cry. We've been waiting for you to say something for the last 18 years. And I was just dumbfounded. I was like, oh my gosh, like they gave me no clue. Although if you know me and you see me, it's like, it's so obvious, it was my own denial of that. And they're like, you're our child and we love you no matter what, And so that, I felt sad. I grieved the fact that I lost 18 years, of a real relationship with my parents, but better late than never. And so, we continued. They paid for our, my partner and my wedding, they totally supported us. They embraced my life partner. And, it's been really sweet since then.
And they came out with 3 pieces of advice for you. 2 of which I sort of understand. You need to get your finances in order. Okay. Self-defense class.
Right.
All right. But the last one, you say your dad pipes up. He hasn't said anything all along, and he says you have to change all the appliances in your kitchen. Can you elaborate on what the thinking was there? Was it were your appliances not appropriate for a recently come out person? Was this something that he'd been meaning to get off his chest for a while?
Yeah, I think he was just trying to connect somehow, and he just couldn't get anything. He was already probably overwhelmed by the whole process that we were actually being, connecting emotionally. And so, yeah, my father's a real, he's a very acts of service kind of guy in his love language. And so it's all about the practical, and I lived in my apartment for a while, and the appliances actually needed to get replaced. And actually, that's the first thing we did. The next thing I did was, get my finances in order. And then years later, I took a self-defense class. So the list is complete. And yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about this feeling like you fitting in and not fitting in, and belonging and not belonging. Because I think that this is both I think this is a universal experience. And certainly when you don't fit into the dominant culture, it's even more of an experience. Or another way to say that would be someone like me, a straight white man, can still feel like I don't belong in lots of ways, but I don't have the cultural sense of not belonging. And I thought you really brought this together in a beautiful way, because you talked about going to a retreat. I think it was your first retreat at Spirit Rock that was LGBTQ retreat, right? And you get there and you think, all right, I'm going to be with my people. But you talk about how profoundly still you felt like you didn't belong. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because I think there's a lot of power in that story.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. It was, I think the conditioning in me to have that sense of not belonging anywhere, even translated, into like a community that I was actually a part of. And I noticed for the first 3 days on that retreat that I kept comparing myself to others. It's like, and this retreat was at Spirit Rock out in California. So, of course, many of the queer folks there had tattoos and piercings and, were just so hip and cool. And I was just like East Coast. I have no tattoos. I have no piercings, pretty straight-laced, quote unquote, way. And, I never have felt like enough of something. And so I would just be like, I'm not like, these folks, I'm not trans enough. I'm not queer enough. I'm not even a person of color enough, being Asian in this culture, etc. And so I suffered with that story that I had believed, all my life for like 3 days on that retreat. And I just sat with the pain of this feeling of separation. And so I decided, I just got this insight after a sitting practice where, why am I relying on something external to me to determine my belonging? Why am I waiting for this, outside force to say like, La, you're acceptable, you're lovable, you belong here. And it wasn't like anyone was saying to me, La, you don't belong here. It was all in my head, And so I just decided from then on that, I can just claim my belonging. It reminds me of the story of the Buddha when he got enlightened and Mara was taunting him and seducing him and, berating him. Basically it was just his mind of that he didn't deserve. He's not worthy. And the Buddha put his hand on the ground and basically said, with the earth as my witness, I belong. I deserve to exist. And so I just really try to carry that, with my older wolf, to like, no matter where I am, whether it be in an all, dominant culture environment and I'm the only one yet again, that it's like, bottom line, I do belong. I may not look like or have similar experiences to people here, but I belong and we actually all belong. And so just noticing my tendency to be on guard and that's really a protective mechanism for myself, that I've developed for many years. And ultimately it's like, I'm okay, and I don't have to wait. I always talk about how like, we all are like perfect cakes, and then it's like anything outside of that is like extra nice buttercream is like wonderful. It just adds to the cake. It doesn't like make the cake better. It's just just a nice little addition.
In that story, I was struck by you sort of saying, like, you're alternating between judging yourself, judging them. And I think it's so interesting what groups do to a lot of us. When you put us into a group where we don't know people, for so many of us, that's exactly what starts to happen. And I think that's why groups can be such powerful means of transformation, is if we can watch that process from a place of a little bit higher awareness. We go, oh, look, what's happening? Like, I'm judging you, and then 5 seconds later, I'm judging myself. You suck, I suck. And it's just this whole dance that happens because I feel like I want to belong. And I, some of that is, we know some of that is just what it is to be a human, right? We're wired to want to belong. We're wired to suss out, am I safe? Do I belong? Do I, but again, I think that those things go so much deeper for people who, even in every situation, feel like, they don't belong. It just must, it must be so challenging to get through that. How do you? I'm going to circle back to your original answer about the wolves, because we're kind of back in the same territory, and I wanted to ask this question, which is, you mentioned a younger wolf and an older wolf. The younger wolf being the one that felt like she doesn't belong and she doesn't fit, and the older wolf being one that's a little bit wiser. And I guess I'm curious, do you feel like if you'd had the older wolf in your life as a younger wolf, now I'm really torturing the metaphor here, that it would have helped? Because you do a lot of work with teenagers, and I'm teenagers are a class, that's sort of when like all this underground, like, I'm not sure I belong, like, explodes to the surface. Do you think that it can really help us to have people who are a little further down the path sharing with us, like, hey, of course you feel like you don't belong. That's normal. That's natural, but you do?
Yeah. Oh, most definitely, Eric, for sure. And I loved working with teens, and it was interesting because when I first was approached to teach, teens, I was asked like, oh, La, have you ever experienced working with teens or anything like that? And I said, I have no experience working with teens, and I'm quite afraid of them, and that's always a message for me to actually dive in, and check this out. And a lot of it was that I hadn't healed my own inner teen, the one that felt like they needed to hide and couldn't be fully themselves, and go through the motions of going to the prom when it's like, this is the last thing I want to be doing right now, etc. And so working with teens, and one of the first things I say with teens on retreats is like, let's just put out on the table that we're all a bit awkward. We all just want to be loved, accepted, appreciated for who we are, all of who we are. And what we're going to create here is the world we want to be living in, which is like, you can be all of who you are and feel loved and respected and heard. And so it really is. And so there's so many, teens that I taught during those years that have come out now as gender non-conforming or non-binary. And, it's just, there's this possibility. And then to see someone who's actually happy, that has really has a good life, and that it's possible for them. And it wasn't easy, definitely, growing up. And, I had to find, my happiness inside myself and not rely on it coming from the outside. And at, such a young age, from like 13 to 19, like your approval or acceptance from peers is so important, and so that sense of belonging is very much dependent on the external. And what an older, person can say is like, yeah, that's true. And it shifts and changes as you get older, and you become less and less dependent, on that. At least I did.
Yeah. You are a, how shall I say this, unusual Dharma teacher. And you say this, right, because in that you generally don't write out Dharma talks and really plan and prepare. You say that despite being a person who's hyper-organized in other aspects of your life, in this area you sort of tend to let things happen. You often start off with a song on a ukulele. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that idea of sort of just showing up and letting what emerges emerge. Where do you find, is it courage that allows you to do that, or is it fear that causes you to do that?
Yeah. So when I was in kindergarten, I got a needs improvement in show and tell. And I felt like that just scarred me for so much of my life, of this, like, I can't be in front of a lot of people. And it's been a real, just deep practice, Eric, of just continuing to show up. Because the last thing I ever wanted to be was a teacher. Like, this was not in my trajectory of career. It just happened, in a way, and been given a lot of really wonderful opportunities by dear teachers of mine, exposure, to have these ways of showing up in the world. And I just kind of take it on as a challenge, as a practice for me to keep being myself and showing up as myself. And so as hard as it is for me to sort of write, I'm starting to do that a little bit more, but it's risky, because I can show up in a retreat or a talk and not really know where it's going to go or if it's going to make any sense, or and I think it also helps me just kind of trust myself more. We live in a culture that, like, everything's got to be perfect. It's got to be podcast ready. I always say I'm not podcast ready, when it comes to, like, giving talks and things like that. So it really is that it's okay to be imperfect. It's okay to not know. It's okay to be real and authentic. And it's really resonated for people. It helps people relax a little bit, because we live in such a striving culture, in a culture of perfection, and we can't be acceptable unless we're perfect. And that's how I lived a lot of my life, was trying to be perfect so I could be acceptable. And what I found is, wow, the more imperfect I am, the more acceptable I've actually become. Through the spaces that I've taught.
Right. It's a really interesting dance that between preparation and not being prepared. Like, I prepare a lot for these conversations, but I do it primarily out of a deep respect for the people I'm going to talk to. And then I try and also let go of it to some degree and allow what's going to emerge. And so it's a little bit of a dance to find what's the right way to do it. Now, luckily, I've got Chris, my editor, sitting on the back end, making me sound coherent, which is, believe me, he has work cut out for him very often. I was looking at your practice. You talk a lot about keeping your practice really simple, and you said that there are 4 questions as you go through life that you just sort of use to orient yourself back to the moment and being present and your practice. And I thought maybe we could just talk through those 4 questions. You may not even remember them, given that you stand up and give Dharma talks. Do you remember what the 4 are?
Is your heart open or closed? Are you feeling connected or disconnected? Are you suffering or are you free? And are you feeling empowered or disempowered?
Yeah. So talk to me about how you use those conversations in your life, and then how you use those to guide what you do in the next moment.
So for me, those questions help me determine, like, in a concrete way, if I'm suffering. And when I notice that I'm suffering, so that would be when my heart is closed, I'm feeling disconnected, I'm suffering, and I'm feeling disempowered. It's like this self-compassion just immediately arises. Like, I'll just say to myself, oh my gosh, buddy, you're really, struggling right now. And to, like, just really pause and just allow myself to have my feels about whatever it is I'm going through, whether I'm feeling sad or angry or disappointed or shut down. And so when I'm able to allow myself, and this was not something that I was allowed to do as a child, to have my feelings and understand what my feelings are and to work with them. I don't think many of us, were ever really taught that. And so when I'm able to tend to that, then I can get, okay, I may be feeling this way, but I can cultivate a different way of being, one that actually will have me feeling more connected, having my heart open, feeling freer, and also empowered. And so it really is, because my tendency in the past was to bypass it. I'll say oh, La, you're a Dharma teacher. You shouldn't be feeling these feelings. You should know better, kind of thing. And so these questions really bring me back home to just getting wow, I'm actually, my heart is closed. I'm feeling disconnected. I'm not empowered, and I'm suffering. So let me take care of myself right now, because I don't have the capacity to do the next thing until I tend to what's right here. And, like I said, we live in a culture where we just kind of, bypass, all that, and then we react to things rather than consider and respond in a more skillful way. So I don't do it, I'm definitely not skillful all the time. You can get my partner to tell you that. But she often questions are you sure you're a mindfulness teacher? And I'm I love that, because it's just so humbling just to remember I'm also human, and I'll fall off the wagon and I'll get back on the wagon, and I can forgive myself and I can have compassion for myself, especially when I'm struggling and I'm not necessarily getting
Have
it
you
right.
found that, suddenly being made, not made to be, asked to be a mindfulness teacher and agreeing to step into that role, you mentioned that those feelings of well, shouldn't I know better than this? Shouldn't I be doing better than this? Talk to me about how you work with that. Has that been something that has emerged more for you since you've stepped into that role? Or has that sort of just always been part of your personality, which is you shouldn't feel this way?
Yeah, that's definitely been part of my personality, because if you're that way, then that's going to be more stuff that people can call you on that's not going to be acceptable, right? And so, I feel that, I think it's helped me just become more human, just kind of accepting it's for me, I thought being mindful was doing it right, but actually being mindful is just know what you're doing. And so for me, that distinction was really helpful. And so it was oh, I'm aware that this is what's happening, versus oh, I'm going to get it right. It's I'm aware I'm going to eat that third donut and I know what it's going to do. I'm very aware of that. It may not be the most skillful thing, but I'm aware that I'm doing that, versus just kind of bypassing it, just always doing the right thing.
So say that line again that you said there.
Between
knowing it's right and doing it right?
Yeah, so I thought that being mindful meant doing it right versus being aware of what is happening.
Got it. I just want to write that down. That's a great one. Yeah, I'm struck by, in a lot of cases, how you refer to your practice, how simple you keep it. You say, I keep my practice really simple by noticing my suffering and confronting it with kindness and compassion. I approach my practice with as much courage, willingness, and humility as I can. And I seek to find the Dharma in everything because it's everywhere all the time. So I love that idea. That reminds me of that last line of the Bodhisattva vows, or the great vows for all. They have different names, but the Dharma gates are countless. I vow to wake to them, right? They're everywhere. Are you feeling stressed about the holidays? The pressure to make everything perfect? The tricky family gatherings, trying to keep everybody happy? And for some of you, it's the opposite. It's the feeling of being alone. Either way, it's a lot. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, know that many others feel the same way. But this year can be different. Join me and the One You Feed community for a free online event on December 10th at 12 p.m. Eastern. You'll learn a simple, wise habit that can help you let go of holiday stress and find more peace, steadiness, and real connection. Picture yourself getting through this season feeling grounded, present, and clear without all the pressure to be perfect. Give yourself this free gift of support, learning, and genuine connection with others who get it. Sign up now at oneyoufeed.net/holiday. If you're unable to attend live, we'll be sending the video to people who have registered. So go to oneyoufeed.net/holiday and change the way you experience the holidays.
Yeah, exactly. Because sometimes, we can, when I first came up, I just thought like, oh, sitting retreats all the time and just practicing every day and just being on my cushion was the practice. But there was such a disconnect from what was happening out in the world, what was actually happening with my life. And so to me, it's like taking the training wheels off, when we go out into the world and we engage. And a big question that's going around in certain dominant culture Dharma circles right now is like, well, what does social justice have to do with the Dharma? Like, it actually is the Dharma, because it's all about suffering. And so, it's like if that is making us feel uncomfortable bringing that into our meditation halls or on our cushions, then what are we actually doing on our cushions, And so it really is. It's that cultivation of a heart, as my teacher Eric Colvix, a heart that's ready for anything, And so it really is about bringing that in, and recognizing and allowing ourselves to feel the depth of that suffering, so that we can act from a place of compassion to do something about it.
Yeah, that's one of my, my biggest interests and biggest questions that I look at is, how do we bridge this gap from what we sort of know and maybe even what we practice formally by sitting and meditating and whatever, to all the rest of the moments of our lives, And to me, it seems that the biggest problem is broadly forgetting. It's forgetting that there is a Dharma, or forgetting that there's another way to respond, or forgetting that there's another layer or level of our heart. And we just get in motion in life and just, habitual reactions. And more and more, I think that's the biggest question, and the one that, I am always interested in is, how do people remember, so I guess, how is that evolved for you over time? How did you start to bring the Dharma into more of the moments of your life, and how have you continued to do that?
And so for me, what, I love what you say about like forgetting and remembering, and what helps me remember is taking refuge, taking refuge in the Buddha. And for me, it's not only, the representation of the possibility of awakening, in a lifetime. And it's also recognizing my own Buddha nature. It's recognizing my own innate goodness, my own wisdom and compassion. Everything that we seem to be wanting to buy out there that will bring us happiness is actually in here. And then taking refuge in the Dharma, just the teachings and practices of awareness and compassion, of wisdom and compassion, to be able to see clearly, what is actually happening, so that I can then discern how to engage it, because I have no control over what's happening. I do have control over how I respond, react or respond to what's happening, how I relate to what's happening. And then to, take refuge in the Sangha. So even being around like-minded, like-hearted folks that, will help me remember when I have, sort of strayed off the path, that, we kindly and gently like bring each other back. And that to me is like, we're here to wake each other up, as well as Ram Dass saying, walk each other home. But, to me, they're almost the same thing. And, but it's been painful. I've been part of dominant culture sanghas for a long time, and it's people don't want to be really uncomfortable in waking up. That's why I have my song "Waking Up Is Hard to Do," is because it is uncomfortable, and to me, our practice is learning to be more comfortable being uncomfortable. But so much of mindfulness is being sold as, oh, free yourself from stress or be more productive and more focused at work, etc. What's missing is like, yeah, we have to be with like what's hard and challenging so that we can see it clearly and address it skillfully. And so that's what really like helps me remember, to come back.
Yeah, one of the things that you've talked about is, as we talk about, let me try that again. As we talk about identity, and we've been talking about identity here, whether it be gender identity, sexual identity, race identity, right? As we talk about these things, we have identity, and then as we move into deeper and deeper into the Dharma, we start to encounter ideas that say, hey, there's no self actually here. This quote unquote identity that you're so worried about either protecting or propping up doesn't actually exist. And I've heard you say that that what is the importance of identity in this practice is one of the most important things that we've got to figure out if we're going to have a Dharma that is truly inclusive. So can you share a little bit more about, I guess, how both those things are true, how that identity is absolutely real and true, and it's kind of also not, and how do we work with that?
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Yeah, it's one of the most, I think the teaching on no self is like one of the most confusing, concepts in Buddhism. And especially like with regards to social identities. So to me, the absolute truth is that we're all one. The relative truth is that we don't treat each other that way,
Yeah.
Because, some folks based on their race are treated less than, or their sexual orientation, or gender identity, or class, physical abilities, its mental abilities, etc. And so, yes, so when people say to me, well, we're all one law, why do you need to separate yourselves out as a, BIPOC Sangha or LGBTQIA plus Sangha? And I said, well, whose one are we being?
Say, elaborate on that. Whose one are we being?
Yeah, so if you don't feel like it's important for folks who have felt marginalized, colonized, or oppressed, ancestrally, historically, and, right now in this lifetime, like we can't be all one if they're feeling not safe or not seen or not respected in these dominant culture spaces. That's not inclusion. I have this analogy of like a dominant culture dinner party where they want to invite some new guests to the dinner. And so they're like, the new guests are like, oh, we would love to come. We'd love to bring our food and music because we like to dance after we eat. And the dominant culture host is, no, we already ordered the food. The menu is set. We just need you to sit at the table. That's not inclusion. That's assimilation. Like, we want you here, but we want you here on our terms, versus we want you here and we want you to bring the richness of who you are to us so that we can be here together and learn from each other. There's a real difference. And so, yes, that's the absolute truth that we're definitely aspiring towards, but it is not at all, as we are seeing right now, the way that we treat each other.
I'm curious on a practical level, how we start to bring these things together. As someone who's interested in how communities form and come together, you've certainly got, if you've got a dominant culture, so you've got a Sangha that's, let's say, 98% white people, and you have, a few people who don't quite fit that, who kind of fit in and again are sort of asked to assimilate. You don't have diversity there, right? If on the other hand you have let's say a Sangha that is oriented towards LGBTQ, right? You've got two Sanghas, right? You got one over here and one over here. And I'm kind of curious, how does that, and is it even important that we move towards a Sangha in which it's everyone seen and for who they are and valued for who they are. How have you seen that actually work well in real life, or have you?
It's slow. It's really slow, especially I think, with say the BIPOC Sangha, in my community. It's like it's very few people that are part of that Sangha join the larger dominant culture Sangha. And a lot of it is like people don't feel safe. They don't feel held. Things will be said and, often called microaggressions, etc. Where it's like, I don't even call them microaggressions anymore because they're still harmful, and microaggressions makes like, oh, it's so tiny, it shouldn't really matter. But it does, it has huge impact. And so I do believe it's important for everybody to come together, but I don't think that we're necessarily there yet. I think that the dominant culture has a lot of work to do on themselves around their understanding of themselves, especially as white people, white supremacist, white privileged culture. And then understanding yourself and then understanding the impact of the systems and the institutions that perpetuate, this harm, this marginalization, this oppression of people that aren't white, or, of a dominant culture identity. So I have this phrase that I've coined that's racial is glacial. Like it takes a really long time. And it takes a really long time even in spiritual communities where you would think, oh, well, everyone's got good intention, big hearts, etc. But we're still human beings who are deeply conditioned by the culture. And again, going back to that being called out on things or that feels uncomfortable. And if people aren't willing to be humble and willing to be uncomfortable and being called in or called out, whatever you want to use, whatever term you want to use, it makes it really hard. It doesn't make it safe for folks like myself to want to engage. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Is it appropriate for people who are in the dominant culture to want to be involved in and attend, say, a BIPOC Sangha? Or is that not the right approach, not the right place, not a place that I would belong? I mean, because what I'm trying to find is we certainly know that exposure to each other increases understanding, increases knowledge, increases tolerance. So, this is just somebody who has been recognizes that I have I am part of the dominant culture, in all the ways, right? White, male, cisgendered, and still trying to say, all right, how do I, where do I, and how do I advocate for fairer and more equitable places where I exist?
And so, definitely have gotten a lot of, questions from dominant culture folks saying, oh, can I just join your BIPOC Sangha, because I want to learn, like how to engage and how to be. And it's not appropriate because that space is, a refuge and a safe space for BIPOC folks to be able to not have to worry about, conform, if there's a white person in the room, we do this, a lot of people do it, I have to deal with those folks in my job, all the time. And, here's a really safe space that actually inspires, rejuvenates, resources people so that we can go out into the world. And so to be a good ally would be to be one to, do your own work with your own people. Because, we started doing these on week-long retreats. We would have, the sits in the big hall. And then we would have once a day an affinity sit for LGBTQI plus folks and every other day for the BIPOC folks. And people were like, well, why do they have to separate themselves out? Well, the thing about it is the white folks don't realize when they're in the big meditation hall, they're one big affinity group. And all we're doing in the other room is just being together, like you're being together in that room. We're not talking about revolution, or overthrow.
You're not?
We're just sitting just like you. But there's something about sitting together that just allows us to go deeper because we're not necessarily being activated by, this conditioning that we have, when we're in a mixed group. So it is like a little bit of a refuge to kind of resource ourselves so that we can come and engage, in the bigger group. So it really is. And I think sometimes some dominant culture folks kind of want to just kind of bypass it. Like, why can't we just all just be one together? Like, just all just kind of mix. And it can get pretty messy, if there's not a lot of consciousness, if there's not a lot of like willingness just to deeply listen or know, if you're someone who is entitled to take up a lot of space or has always been able to take up a lot of space, to make space for others, and have their voices included. So there's a lot of practices that need to be in place in order to feel that sense of equity, that sense of belonging, that sense of true, welcome and inclusion.
I guess I should say I don't like it because I wish it wasn't that way, but racial is glacial speaks to something that I feel deeply, which is just this like an impatience with like let's get things better, and yet this like sometimes staring at the problem and being like, wow, this feels colossal, glacial. Yeah. It feels,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and it's so buried in our systems and our institutions. Laws are made to oppress people. You talk about gerrymandering and all those. I mean, there are things that are actively laws being passed to like oppress people. And people don't get that. Maybe they do or maybe they don't. But that's what's happening. That's the result of those. Of those actions. So. Not sure exactly what it's going to take, but it's going to take a long time, whatever it is.
Well, yeah, I think it feels challenging to, particularly when, you do have a fair, what I think is a reasonable amount of the dominant culture that at least is open to things changing. But then, it appears that a significant portion is, like you said, like gerrymandering everything, rolling back voting rights, and it just feels sort of like, oh boy.
Yeah, it's deep. It's real. It's what this country was founded on, was racism.
Do you? Well, I don't want to go too deep down that rabbit hole because we could be here forever. I want to actually pivot a little bit. Not that sure. I'm disagreeing with what you said there, because I was actually about to ask a question about whether are most countries not that way. But I want to change direction just a little bit, which is something that you said, which is related, and I want to understand it a little bit more. You said being open to however life is unfolding and being willing to have my heart broken open over and over again in order to break my own habitual conditioning is my practice. This approach for me is energizing and not draining. And believe me, I've been drained. So I would love, I'm tying this to where we just were, which is when we look at some of these things, what we can feel is very drained. And I'm curious, as you said, like, I find this approach, energizing. Talk to me about how that, what I just read of yours applies to what you and I were just talking about a couple minutes ago, and does it? Or am I taking it out of context?
It is energizing when I'm resourced. In the past month, I've had some really, really painful, draining conversations with, fellow teachers in my own community, and just really getting like, oh, wow, we maybe have moved a centimeter or so in 16 years. And I even joked that, I'm so surprised that I don't have a concussion from banging my head against the wall, trying to explain and, all this stuff to people over these years. But when I find I'm with folks that really want to understand and really want to grow and have the humility to really deeply listen and take responsibility for, their own ignorance or their own, lack of consciousness, then I'm happy to engage. Like, I'm more than willing, but when there is pushback or defensiveness, it's a lot of emotional labor
Sure.
for someone like me to engage in those kinds of conversations. And so I've been much better at saying, like, you know what, I just can't do it. I'll call on an ally to speak up, or I'll give you some links and then you can do some research to, educate yourself. But I really need to conserve my own energy, because this is just my life. I mean, this is just constant, for me. And it's not just this thing I'm going to dabble in just because, I'm feeling guilty or I feel like I need to do something right now.
Yeah.
This is just my existence.
Yeah, I wrestle with that, like as having you on and asking you these questions. I'm trying to do it from a place of hopefully growth and healing and helping others. And I recognize, like, I'm putting you into a particular role that sometimes I feel uncomfortable with.
I think for me, it's part of my own practice, doing this work, DEIA work, for your audience, diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility work for the last 16 years it's really deepened my practice around patience, tolerance, acceptance, compassion. Like, it's really pushed me, in ways that I never imagined. It's opened my heart in ways that I never imagined, to like really, I mean, that's the thing. It's like, I don't want any of this stuff to shut my heart down, Like, my aspiration is to keep my heart open as possible. It's on a dimmer switch, It's kind of like, I'm going to talk to this person. It's going to be down to like 20% open versus like, I'm hanging out with my pups. It'll be 90% open, So, but, it's work that's necessary. It's super important, like, all of our lives depend on it. And a dear friend of mine a friend of mine that I just made was on a panel this past week, and she said, racism will not stop until white people end it. And so it really is not necessarily our job, but I feel like because I have the capacity, I think that was the blessing and maybe hindrance of being assimilated growing up. It's like I can hang in these spaces, in dominant culture spaces, with a little bit more ease than some of my, maybe BIPOC, friends. And so if I can, be a bridge, or if, a few white folks wake up a little bit, just being in my presence and in conversation, then I'm happy, It's something that I can give, so...
Well, let's end on, first I want to say that I love that analogy of heart open versus closed on a dimmer switch. I love that idea. And I also loved where you talked about the non-binary nature of gender gives you that ability to float in between things, kind of makes you a middle way expert. I love that. I may have put slight words in your mouth there, but I think that's close to what you were saying, and I think that dimmer switch is a beautiful example of that. Is my heart open or closed is pretty binary. Noticing that it's 75% open, okay, that's pretty good. That's all right. But where I wanted to end was with. Let me find it. Where to go? I want to end by talking about Casey, your dog, because I think you and I have had a very similar experience, which is that you talk about Casey, which is a dog you only had for 4 months, who really opened your heart. And I came to dogs later in life, did not like them most of my life. I don't know if that would be where you were. I was a vehement anti-dog person, and had a dog that opened my heart. But share a little bit about Casey and in what ways an animal was able to open your heart in ways that humans weren't.
Yeah, thank you for that, Eric. Yeah, I'm the same as you. I used to think that people had pets because they didn't want to deal with other people.
It might be true.
you know, and it probably is. And so, we adopted Casey from my parents when my mom got diagnosed with a terminal brain tumor. And, it was this like just little being. Casey was a Norwich Terrier, which is like a really small, compact little spunky little dog. And she was about 12 when we adopted her. And she just was my companion, during my mom's last year of life. And, she was just always there, just lay beside me when I would cry. And there was just something about like this silent little being, just the presence of that unconditional love. Sometimes human love can be so conditional, but with a dog, with an animal, it was my first taste of that kind of unconditional love. And so we've had 3 more dogs since then, and it's pure joy, and definitely a practice of patience and acceptance and messiness, which I don't tolerate very well. So it's also a good practice in, confronting my need for order in my life. But yeah, Casey was truly a real gift that was totally unexpected. And that's so much of like how I just trust life, like life will bring me what I need, the people, the animals, the experiences, and I just flow with it, as best I can.
Mine was Sadie, and was the one who opened my heart. And I know that Tara Brock is a teacher you've worked closely with, was a spitting image, like literally twins of her, Sadie. When Tara and I talked on the interview, we shared photos. We're like, oh my God, like it's just uncanny. But yeah, Sadie's the one who opened my heart, and I often feel like it just feels like the biggest gift that like somewhere near midlife I discovered this whole species of creatures that I had no appreciation for, that I'm now like is one of the greatest joys of my life. I just feel so fortunate in that regard. It's been such a lovely thing.
Yeah.
Well, La, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It has been a real pleasure to have you on, and I'm really grateful that we got to spend this time together.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
If what you just heard was helpful to you, please consider making a monthly donation to support the One You Feed podcast. When you join our membership community with this monthly pledge, you get lots of exclusive members-only benefits. It's our way of saying thank you for your support. Now, we are so grateful for the members of our community. We wouldn't be able to do what we do without their support, and we don't take a single dollar for granted. To learn more, make a donation at any level, and become a member of the One You Feed community, go to oneyoufeed.net/join. The One You Feed podcast would like to sincerely thank our sponsors for supporting the show.